A new poll among likely Democratic voters in California has Senator Bernie Sanders with a slight lead in the state. The Change Research poll conducted for KQED found Sanders with 26% support. Senator Elizabeth Warren had 23%, and former Vice President Joe Biden had 19%. Let's bring in Sean Sullivan. He's a CBSN political contributor and national politics reporter for The Washington Post. Hi, Sean. So are you surprised by any of these numbers, and what do you take away from this poll out of California? Does it suggest to you the field is still wide open, or is it really just narrowing in on these three candidates?
Well, it's not really that surprising, Tanya. When you look at this poll, it's very much in line with other polls that we've seen, not just in California, but across the board. This really does look like a wide open race. But what this does also underscore is the importance of California in this nominating process and how it's different from past years, because California, which is going to have a lot of delegates up for grabs, moved up its primary. It's now going to be on March 3rd. That's earlier than the past, and people will be starting to get ballots through the mail in February when these earlier contests in Iowa and New Hampshire are happening. So a lot of focus from these campaigns on the state of California, probably more than we've seen in the past. And as this poll shows, it is pretty wide open right now. The Sanders campaign from the very beginning has talked a lot about California. When they talk about their path to the nomination and the early states, they often group California into that category. So there's a lot of focus from the Sanders campaign on California. He's going to be campaigning pretty aggressively there in the coming days. And so it does seem wide open right now. Biden and Warren do seem to be the two that have the best chance, along with Sanders in that state. But across the board, this is what we're seeing in South Carolina, Iowa, New Hampshire, everywhere. We're sort of seeing these 3- and 4-way races all over the map. And so it does really look wide open right now.
All right. So we know now that Thursday's Democratic primary debate will go on as scheduled after all of the qualified candidates threatened to not show up because of that labor dispute at the site. Can you tell us about how that dispute was resolved?
Well, I think the DNC is breathing a bit of a sigh of relief right now that it has been resolved, and they got in the middle of this and tried to get both sides to come to the table, and it looks like they have, and it looks like they've reached a deal. It wasn't that long ago, 24, 48 hours ago, when it didn't look like we were going to have a debate, because these candidates who have been fighting to portray themselves as champions of the working class and champions of workers, they said, look, we're not going to cross the picket line here. We're standing with these food service workers as they're in this standoff, this contract standoff with their employer. But it looks like now that there is a deal, this debate's going to move forward, and the DNC, which has been trying to put together all these debates, has averted disaster, at least for the moment. But what this episode does show is how strongly these candidates are trying to run as champions of the working class. The fact that none of them were willing to cross the picket line speaks volumes about the tone of this primary and what these candidates are trying to do as they fight for these votes in the early states.
Absolutely. And Sean, this week's debate also comes after 9 Democratic presidential candidates, 9, wrote a letter to the DNC asking it to change the qualifying rules for debates. Has the DNC signaled it may be open to changing the rules at this point in the game?
If anything, the DNC has signaled the opposite, that they are not open to doing that. It is rare to see these candidates sort of come together in a show of solidarity on anything, but in this case, it looks like they have. But what the DNC has said is, look, we put together a debate structure at the beginning of this election cycle. We made it clear that this is how we were going to do things, and they're sticking to that. And their argument is essentially that as we go deeper and deeper into the primary, it should be tougher for these candidates to qualify. And so the debate stages that we saw earlier this year, where we saw many candidates or 2 different debate stages, we're not seeing that anymore. And the argument the DNC is effectively making is that's a good thing for voters. We're getting down to crunch time. Iowa caucuses are only a few weeks away, and so this field should be winnowing, and so it should be tougher. But of course, these candidates are arguing that this is not something that is fair across the board. This is not something that has allowed some candidates who have struggled to gain traction to get attention on national TV. But right now, it looks like the DNC is going to stand firm and that they're not going to budge on this. But, you know, it looks like this probably won't be the end of these candidates, or at least some of the candidates, trying to apply public pressure on them, trying to get a seat on the debate stage in future weeks.
All right, we'll see what happens in January, right? All right, so there are reports that Michael Bloomberg made sexist remarks and created a culture that was degrading to women at his company. Several women reportedly sued and signed non-disclosure agreements. Bloomberg has denied those reports, but Senator Elizabeth Warren called on Bloomberg to respond yesterday. Let's listen to what she said.
When women raise concerns like this, we have to pay attention. We have to listen to them. And if Michael Bloomberg has made comments like this, then he has to answer for them. I think NDAs are a way for people to hide bad things they've done. And I think that women should be able to speak. They need to be released from NDAs. Yes, I do.
So, Sean, does this signal a potential problem for Bloomberg's campaign?
Well, it certainly signals that this is something he's probably going to have to answer more questions about, especially given that one of his chief rivals in this race, Senator Warren, is speaking about this. And this is something that could potentially even come up in this week's debate, even though Bloomberg's not going to be on the stage with the rest of the candidates. This could be something that other candidates are going to be asked to weigh in on. And this is part of the scrutiny of a presidential campaign. These candidates' pasts, their business ties, their government ties, the ways that they made their money, the ways that they conducted themselves as they did their jobs are getting more scrutiny than ever before. And so as Bloomberg moves forward in this campaign, I think he can expect to be scrutinized heavily and for questions about these lawsuits to be asked of him, you know, when he's campaigning in these key states across the country. And as his campaign and their surrogates are campaigning, they can also be expected to be answering these questions as well.
Right. And Sean, as you know, the House is expected to vote Wednesday on impeaching President Trump. All signs are pointing to this going to a Senate trial. How could this impact the 5 senators who are currently running for president? I mean, aside from keeping them off the campaign trail, could it have a further impact?
Yeah, there's sort of 2 challenges here, the political challenge and the logistical challenge. The logistical challenge is if this is a lengthy trial and they need to be in Washington for much of the week, what does that mean for their travel schedules? What does that mean for the time that they're going to be able to spend in Iowa? We're getting to that point in the cycle where most of these candidates, you know, historically have ended up sort of just camping out in these early states. And so they're going to have to figure that out. That also depends on how long this trial goes. If it's a 1-week trial versus a 5-week trial, that's very, very different. But then there's also sort of a political challenge here when they're also going to have to balance the rigors of this impeachment trial if it does indeed happen. And they're going to have to be jurors and they're going to have to give all of their attention to that. And they're going to be asked about that everywhere they go. At the same time, they're going to be trying to make their closing arguments to voters in these early states as to why they should be the ones that are winning in Iowa, New Hampshire, and elsewhere. And so balancing those 2 things could possibly present a bit of a challenge. And then the third thing is just sort of breaking through at a moment when a lot of attention is focused on impeachment. And if there's a trial, a lot of attention is going to be focused on a trial. And so how do you get voters to pay attention to your latest TV ad or your latest policy proposal or your latest endorsement in the campaign? That's going to be a challenge, too, for some of these candidates.
All right. Well, Sean Sullivan in Washington, we thank you so much for your insight.
Thanks, Tanya.